Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take all your source material and we pull out the most interesting and insightful information. Today we're looking at true crime, specifically the case of Benjamin Atkins, also known as the Woodward Corridor Killer.
Mm.
Our sources today are excerpts from Wikipedia,
Okay.
which give us a pretty comprehensive overview of Atkins. We'll be exploring his life, his crimes, and ultimately trying to answer a very difficult question. What transforms a troubled child into a monster?
That's a question that has haunted criminologists and psychologists for centuries. And the answer, as you might imagine, is rarely simple.
Yeah. So let's unpack Atkins' early life. He was born in Detroit. His parents were drug addicts.
Okay.
His mother abandoned him at a young age. And he ended up spending years in an orphanage where he faced both physical and sexual abuse.
Oh, wow.
He's even raped at the age of 10. To say this was a rough start would be a massive understatement.
It's really hard to overstate the impact of this kind of trauma, especially at such a young age. When a child experiences that level of neglect and abuse, it can fundamentally alter their development, affecting everything from their emotional regulation to their ability to form healthy relationships.
And unfortunately, the trauma didn't end there. Wikipedia mentions Atkins later witnessed his own mother involved in prostitution as a teenager. Thinking about that, it's disturbing how such behavior could become almost normalized in someone's life.
Absolutely. It's not just the trauma itself, but the context in which it occurs. Witnessing that kind of behavior could have seriously skewed Atkins' perception of women, relationships, and even basic human dignity. And these are all factors that could contribute to the development of antisocial personality disorder, which is characterized by a disregard for social norms and the rights of others, something we see later in Atkins' life.
It sounds like his teenage years didn't offer much of an escape from this difficult path. Wikipedia says he ran away, lived on the streets, battled drug addiction, and bounced between low-paying jobs.
These are all classic risk factors for criminal behavior, especially when layered on top of a foundation of severe childhood trauma.
Yeah.
When you lack a stable home, supportive relationships, and the means to improve your circumstances, it's easy to see how someone could become trapped in a cycle of crime and despair.
It was during this time that Atkins began to exhibit what the Wikipedia excerpts call misogynistic tendencies. I find this especially disturbing given his early experiences.
That's a key point. It suggests that Atkins' early trauma may have manifested as a deep-seated hatred towards women. It's a complex issue, and it's crucial to avoid simplistic explanations. But it's possible that his experiences contributed to a warped view of women, fueling his later crimes.
And that brings us to the period known as the Woodward Corridor Killings. This took place in Detroit, Michigan, between December 1991 and August 1992. Atkins preyed on vulnerable women in this area, often prostitutes and drug addicts, luring them to abandoned buildings.
The Woodward Corridor itself, with its history of economic decline and crime, sadly provided a backdrop for Atkins' crimes. It offered both easy targets and a degree of anonymity.
According to his later confession, his first victim was Patricia Cannon George. She was found in January of 1992, but the killings had actually started earlier, in December of 91.
It's a chilling example of how serial killers often escalate. Atkins likely started with less violent crimes, and as he evaded capture, his boldness and brutality grew.
The details in the Wikipedia excerpts are really unsettling. His second victim, Debbie Ann Friday, was found strangled on December 14th. Then only a few weeks later, on January 3rd, Bertha Jean Mason was discovered murdered in a similar manner. Each one strangled. Many were sexually assaulted.
Wow.
The police actually questioned him in late January, but they had to release him because they didn't have enough evidence.
That moment, that close call with the law, could have been a turning point for Atkins. It's possible it fueled a sense of invincibility, making him even more reckless and dangerous.
Sadly, that seems to be the case. 3 more bodies, Valerie Chalk, Juanita Hardy, and a Jane Doe were found in the Monterey Hotel. We now know the Jane Doe was recently identified through forensic genealogy. And then there's the tragic case of Brenda Mitchell. She was a mother and was found with a scarf tied tightly around her neck.
It's heartbreaking. In these later killings, we see a clear pattern of dehumanization. His victims become almost interchangeable in his mind. It's this detachment that allows him to commit such heinous acts.
The list of victims is hard to comprehend. Vicki Beasley Brown, Joanna Rourke, each life cut short, each with their own story.
It's important to remember that each name represents a human being. Someone with hopes and dreams, with loved ones who grieved their loss. It's easy to get lost in the details of a case like this, but never forget the human cost.
Well, in August of 1992, Atkins' reign of terror finally came to an end. But it was a previous rape charge that led to his arrest, not the murders. It's wild how sometimes seemingly unrelated events can unravel a much larger criminal enterprise.
This is where the story takes a really interesting turn and where the complexities of criminal investigation come into play.
The rape victim, Darlene Saunders, identified Atkins. And this time the police had what they needed. They brought him in for an intense 12-hour interrogation. That eventually led to a confession.
Confessions are a powerful tool in criminal cases, but they're not without their issues. There's always the possibility of coercion, false confessions, and the mental state of the suspect has to be taken into account.
Well, get this. Atkins not only confessed to the rape, but he also confessed to 11 murders. He went into detail about the victims, their clothing, and even led police to the bodies of his last two victims, Osina Waymer and LaTanya Shawanda Smith.
This level of detail is unusual. It suggests a need for control, a desire to maintain a sense of power even when facing overwhelming evidence.
And what reason did he give for these horrific acts? You guessed it. He said he hated prostitutes. Is it ever really that simple, though?
Rarely. Motives in cases like this are multi-layered. There's a complex interplay of psychological factors, personal experiences, and justifications the killer uses to rationalize their actions.
Okay. So we have a confession, a string of murders, and a deeply troubled past. Now what? Well, next comes the trial, and that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive into the case of the Woodward Corridor Killer. So we've established Atkins confessed to these horrific crimes, but a confession doesn't necessarily equal a conviction. What happened next?
Well, as you can imagine, the trial was a media frenzy.
Oh, yeah.
A confessed serial killer, the families of the victims demanding justice. This was a story that captivated the public's attention.
A Wikipedia excerpt say the trial itself started in January of 1994. Apparently, it was an incredibly long and complex process with something like 150 witnesses, many connected to the victim.
Oh, wow.
That must have been incredibly emotionally charged.
It's crucial to remember the human cost of these crimes. Beyond the legal arguments and the media spectacle are real people whose lives have been shattered. Their pain, their loss, that's an essential part of the story.
Initially, Atkins stuck with his confession. But as the trial progressed, he changed his plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. What does that actually mean in a legal context?
That's a great question. It's important to understand that the legal definition of insanity is very specific. It's not simply about having a mental illness.
Right.
The defense has to prove that at the time of the crimes, the defendant was unable to understand the nature and wrongfulness of their actions.
That seems like a pretty high bar to clear.
It is. You're essentially trying to reconstruct someone's state of mind from months, sometimes years ago. It often involves expert testimony, psychological evaluations, and it frequently becomes a battle of the experts with different opinions.
Atkins' defense team really leaned into his traumatic childhood. They argue that the abuse and neglect he suffered was so severe that it essentially broke him, leading him down this horrible path. This raises a really tough question. Can we hold someone accountable for their actions if those actions are, to some extent, a product of their environment and experiences?
That's the heart of the debates surrounding the insanity defense. It forces us to grapple with the concepts of free will, culpability, and the role of societal factors in shaping an individual's behavior. There are no easy answers here.
Well, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict: guilty. Atkins was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole.
It's a harsh but perhaps understandable outcome. In such a brutal case, with this many victims and such a clear pattern of predatory behavior, the justice system often leans towards punishment over rehabilitation.
The Wikipedia excerpts say that Atkins died in prison in 1997 from complications related to AIDS. It's a somewhat anticlimactic end to such a horrific chapter.
It does make you reflect, though. Even those who commit monstrous acts are still human beings, subject to the same frailties and vulnerabilities as anyone else.
So we've explored Atkins' troubled childhood, his descent into violence, the investigation, the trial. It's a lot to process. What are the key takeaways here? What can we learn from a case like this?
For me, one of the most significant aspects is the devastating impact of childhood trauma. While it certainly doesn't excuse Atkins' actions, understanding the role it played in his development can help us identify and support at-risk individuals much earlier on.
It's a powerful reminder that prevention is key. Maybe if there had been more support systems in place, things could have turned out differently for Atkins.
Absolutely. But it's not just about individual intervention. We also need to address the systemic issues that contribute to crime and violence: poverty, lack of access to mental health care, and the often dismissive way society views certain groups, especially women. These are all factors that create an environment where violence can thrive.
Tackling those systemic issues feels pretty overwhelming. Where do we even begin?
It starts with awareness and education. We need to have these uncomfortable conversations about the root causes of violence. We have to challenge our own biases, advocate for policies that support vulnerable communities, and work to create a culture where violence is not tolerated.
It's a tall order, but you're right. We can't just shrug our shoulders and say it's too big a problem. We each have a responsibility to do what we can to make a difference.
Exactly. Even small actions multiplied across a community can have a ripple effect. We can volunteer at organizations that help at-risk youth, donate to charities that address poverty and homelessness, and most importantly, speak out against injustice when we see it.
There's power in those small actions. I like that. It makes it feel a little less daunting than trying to solve these huge problems all at once.
Remember, change is a process. It's a marathon, not a sprint. But by staying informed, working together, and refusing to accept the status quo, we can create a safer and more just world.
Before we move on, there's one more detail from the Wikipedia excerpts that I found really interesting. It's about one of Atkins' victims. Remember that unidentified Jane Doe, one of the 3 women found at the Monterey Hotel?
Yes, the one finally identified in 2024 using forensic genealogy.
Well, it turns out her family requested her name be withheld from the public.
That's a poignant reminder of the enduring impact of these crimes, even decades later. The victims' families carry a burden of grief and trauma that most of us can't even imagine. For some, anonymity might offer a shield from further pain and scrutiny.
It really underscores that there are countless untold stories within these larger narratives. Each victim had a life, a family, a future stolen from them.
It's so important to acknowledge that human cost, to remember that behind the statistics and case files are real individuals whose lives were tragically cut short, and to recognize the ripple effect of these crimes, how they impact families and communities for generations.
It brings us back to your earlier question about whether these tragedies could have been prevented. Were there missed opportunities for intervention in Atkins' case?
It's impossible to say for certain, of course. But looking back at his life, the warning signs were definitely there. The severe childhood trauma, the descent into addiction and crime. Perhaps with the right support systems in place, his path might have been different.
But it's not just about Atkins, right? It's about recognizing the broader societal issues that create environments where violence can flourish.
Precisely. Poverty, lack of access to mental health care, the way society often devalues and marginalizes certain groups, especially women. These are all factors that contribute to a culture of violence.
These are enormous systemic challenges. It can feel overwhelming to even consider where to begin addressing them.
It's true. These are complex problems with no easy solutions. But as we discussed earlier, change starts with small steps. Educating ourselves about these issues, supporting organizations working to make a difference, having open and honest conversations with our friends and family about these difficult topics. These are all ways to contribute to a solution.
And maybe by shedding light on these dark corners of human behavior, by understanding the complex factors that contribute to violence, we can prevent future tragedies.
That's the hope, isn't it? That by delving into these difficult stories, by confronting the uncomfortable truths, we can learn and grow, and ultimately create a better future.
Well, this has been a truly sobering deep dive. To our listeners, if this conversation has piqued your interest, I encourage you to explore further. There are many resources available online and at your local library to learn more about serial killers, the impact of childhood trauma, and the criminal justice system.
Knowledge is power. The more we understand these complex issues, the better equipped we are to address them.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the case of Benjamin Atkins, let's carry with us not just the chilling details of his crimes, but also the larger questions they raise. How can we create a world where such tragedies are less likely to occur? What role can each of us play in building a safer, more compassionate society? These are the challenges we must face, not with fear, but with a determination to learn, to grow, and to create a better future for all.